Joining me now is esteemed geologist and author, Professor Ian Plimer. Professor, let's start with Chris Bowen. His green dreams have been dealt another blow after a world-leading offshore wind developer officially abandoned plans to build a proposed offshore wind farm in the Illawarra wind zone. And when asked about this, Chris Bowen's office has refused to confirm whether there are other companies with any interest in stepping in to fill this void. Will the taxpayers have to step in here and heavily subsidise this plan or provide even more incentives for companies to bid for the project?
Well, these plans are already very heavily subsidised, and we also pay very high electricity to keep them going. Now, we find in the UK that they had tenders for these offshore wind monstrosities, and one tender wasn't even filled. They had no one bidding for it. We found the same in Canada. We found the same in Europe. The costs are too high. The money's not there, and people are not prepared to pay the risk. But wait for it. I've got a great idea. Instead of putting such wind turbines on the Illawarra coast, why don't we put them on the Central Coast, just offshore from Mr. Albanese's $4.3 million holiday home? If he was a man of principle, he would love to see offshore Copacabana covered in these wind turbines, and the best way to fund it would be from the superannuation of politicians. That would be the ideal principles that Mr. Albanese could demonstrate to us. Now, he would have a view of the turbines. It would be the only scheme he'd have which had been successful after all the voice had and everything else he touches falls apart. So I think this is the way to do it. Forget all the coal underneath. Forget the fact that there's coal-fired power stations and coal mines just to the north of him. Cover the Central Coast with these. And then when you've done that, do green seats and teal seats with wind turbines. They're not economic. The taxpayers funding them. The electricity consumers funding them. And if people who are skinning us alive can't see there's a quid to be made, then there has to be a problem with them.
Now, Chris Bowen is still focusing on the coalition's energy policy. He's continuing to attack the opposition's nuclear policy. He posted this on X. He said, experts have told us that Peter Dutton's nuclear scheme could cost $600 billion, take 20 years, only secure 4% of the energy grid, and push up your power bills hundreds of dollars. Ian, if this is the case for a uranium-rich country like us, why are so many other first world nations, from Sweden to Japan to the US, investing so heavily in nuclear energy?
Because these numbers are wrong. Just look at Finland. Their electricity costs went down enormously by putting in big reactors. The same happened in Sweden. We have a large amount of electricity. More than 70% of the electricity from France comes from nuclear reactors. They have the cheapest power in Europe. These numbers are demonstrably wrong. And if he's going to jump up and down about the opposition's numbers, I want to see the numbers that he's suggesting for these thousands of kilometres of high voltage wires that have to cover farmlands from distal power stations, from these wind turbines out in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't costed anything. So once he starts costing his own projects, then he can start worrying about costing of other projects. But this doesn't pass the pub test. We know that in other countries, nuclear is reliable and it's cheap. And the last point is, he hasn't costed in how unreliable energy affects the economy. If you have a power failure, if you have a power outage and you're pouring metal in a foundry, that metal freezes. That costs a large amount of money. So if you've got nuclear or coal or gas at 24/7, 365, you can have cheap, reliable energy.
Now, finally, I want to get your thoughts on SpaceX pulling off a massive feat in aerospace engineering with these mechanical arms on the launch tower of its flagship rocket called Starship, catching the rocket's booster module after it self-detached following takeoff. The footage is just mind-blowing that they managed this spectacular achievement, Ian. I'm interested in your thoughts because I'm not. This is an area that doesn't normally interest me, but even I've watched this footage over and over again in awe.
I think it's just absolutely fabulous. What engineers can do is to solve problems and solve problems which we thought were impossible. Now, they can also do that with our power grid. They can also do it with energy. It's done every day in mines. It's done on farms. So it is the engineers, not the ideological politicians, that actually solve problems. And some of them, like this, it looks impossible, but it happened. So all I say is we should glorify our engineers who can give us the modern world.
And it just shows you what could happen in the private sector. You see all the money that's gone to NASA in recent years, and they didn't pull this off. Elon Musk and SpaceX did.
Yes, and there were no government committees trying to solve these problems. And my experience has been the government committees don't solve problems. They create income from people who are eminently unemployable, and it's endless. At the end of a committee session, they have another problem to solve. So I just think this is a marvel of engineering supported by capitalism, supported by private enterprise, and we really should let governments get out of the way, reduce the number of people in the public service, and actually start building things like a nation.
Hallelujah. Professor Ian Plimer, thank you so much for your time this evening.